Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm super excited to be here with two amazing guests, Daniel Barvin, who's the VP of Operations and Patient Advocacy at Koya Therapeutics, as well as co-founder of End the Legacy, which is a nonprofit that's focused on creating community advocacy and resources for the ALS community, with a particular focus on people affected by genetic forms of ALS. And I'm also really excited to be joined by Dr. Paul Wicks, who's a neuropsychologist, ALS patient advocate, and a consultant to a range of clinical research and digital therapeutics companies, including us, Sono Genetics. So Paul, Daniel, thank you so much. I wonder if you'd want to just give a quick background to yourselves and why this topic of empowering ALS families is so important to you.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thank you so much, Patrick, for having both of us. I found myself a part of this community at a very young age. When I went through sadly, the downfall of my father's generation, starting with his father, my grandfather with an unknown dementia, then his oldest son, my uncle, with ALS, then my aunt with ALS, and my father kind of fighting along that path, FTD. Then found myself as a member of that community when a genetic test came back for my father showing that he carried C9orf72. And then that whole unraveling of my future and my understanding of my future occurred. Found out I was a gene carrier, really became upset with the norms that were around in the community and decided to make change and start a ruckus because the standard quo was not okay, how our community was treated. And that all led to End the Legacy. And now my work at Koya, where I'm hoping to end the horrors that many of us have faced we only have this incredibly small amount of time once these diseases take place in our loved ones, and we're just trying to increase the amount of time we have left with the people we love. So I'll leave it there and we'll get into other things. Paul, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Daniel. No, it's interesting hearing your history on that, because I've almost come at it from a very different perspective, and then the two of us have converged a little bit later in our lives and our careers. So about 22 years ago, I started a PhD studying ALS back at King's College London in the UK. And the particular angle I was studying was whether or not people with ALS could also get cognitive changes, could also get behavioral problems as a result of their ALS. And historically, it was thought that people living with ALS only had problems in the movement parts of their neurological system. So their ability to walk, to speak, to breathe. And the doctor that named ALS actually said the brain is unaffected. And partially as a result of that, for over 150 years, no one looked in a great deal of detail. And that was some real, spotlight effect or blindness that the field had. But throughout the 1990s, a body of researchers, including my supervisors, combined things like neuropsychological tests, cognitive tests with neuroimaging. And indeed, that was what my PhD was about. So I was running cognitive tests. My research collaborator, Professor Martin Turner, now from Oxford, was running the PET scans and MRI scans. But we weren't just looking at people with the sort of sporadic form of ALS. We were actually looking at people with genetic subtypes. So I was particularly looking for people who'd inherited ALS. And at the time, the only gene we knew about was one called SOD1. And that's now we know the second most common ALS causing genetic variant. And then everybody else who had an inherited form of the disease, we just didn't know what gene they had. They were just non-SOD1. And yet through my research, what became clear is that many of these people had behavioral changes. And actually, it was a couple of years after I completed my PhD that this gene finding was discovered, what you mentioned earlier, the C9orf72 expansion repeat, that we now know when it occurs in families, in some individuals presents as ALS affecting movement. In some individuals presents as frontotemporal dementia, FTD, where people's frontal lobe is particularly affected, and that's part of your brain that affects your regulation of emotion, regulation of behavior. And so we see these very challenging behaviors where people can become disinhibited, they can have big personality changes, big mood swings. And then really, tragically, many of them will have ALS and FTD, or known as ALS/FTD in the literature. So I've been studying that for a long time. working a lot through digital means to try and connect all these people, because obviously just due to their rarity, it's hard to get a sample size, but over the internet, we could gather large groups. And then about 10 years ago, my perspective changed again when, by purely coincidence, this is not why I'm in the field, my father-in-law was diagnosed with ALS. And so we underwent some of the genetic testing processes, and clearly had to reflect, had to feel that sort of Damocles sensation of what does this mean for the affected individual? What does this mean, for their children and my children, and all the rest of it? And so, as you said, Daniel, we've sort of got now these communities of people who are in this kind of space, some who are positive for carrying the gene, some who are negative, but all of us are absolutely committed to, pulling on this thread to unravel this awful disease.
Yeah, I'd love to actually talk about on the topic of organizing and getting together. Daniel, you're obviously a co-founder of And the Legacy, so you think a lot about how to support people in a similar situation like you. We want to spend most of this time talking about some of the strategies for how families can actually support one another or get support from other means. But I think it would help to just start with some of the major challenges that you see that families that engage with you do face. So we're all talking about the same things, and we're thinking across the board: logistical challenges, financial challenges, emotional challenges, because obviously it affects every area of life. So maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the big areas that you see people coming to your organization for support for.
Sure. So let me take a step back before I touch on those points. I think we want to first size the community that we believe is affected, those who carry the gene, those who might be at risk. And through some studies that End Legacy has done, we believe that community size is in the range of 500,000 people just in the US. So the numbers are pretty dramatic. We think of genetic ALS and FTD as a very rare disease, not affecting many people. And what we've seen is some of the initial problems of touching that community is just access. Most people do not understand that they are a part of a genetic ALS or FTD family. Like myself, it took me until I was 27 years old, had lost my aunt, uncle, and father. Through all three of those illnesses, we still had no idea that it was a hereditary form of the disease, or that any of these diseases were connected. So at that point, we were unengaged, unconnected, had no ability to access resources because we didn't even know we were a part of the community.
Yeah.
So I think the first step is, and something that I tried to do a lot of, is telling these stories and getting them far and wide enough so that people understand that that sounds like something my family's going through. I should look into this. And I think that if we can engage people to understand that there are opportunities available to them, that they are a part of a community, then the actual work can start. But if we don't ever touch them, if they're not engaged, we can't even do the work we want to do. So I think it starts there. And then, obviously there's so many difficulties with diseases like ALS and FTD, especially when they're happening over and over again in a family. I was looking up a recent study on how the cost of caring for one ALS patient over their lifetime, and it's about $1.5 million. So you now see that happen 2-3 times in a family unit. It's financially draining. A lot of these families in the genetic world did not have any insight that this was coming their way. They were blindsided each time. Maybe eventually they start to figure it out, but no one had the opportunity to obtain life insurance, long-term care insurance, financial, things that would help them fight those incredible costs. So, I think, and I'll stop there if anyone wants to jump in, but I think that these two things really just make the community we're working with already at such a disadvantage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Anything you wanted to add to that, Paul?
Yeah, just to say that, as I've been working more closely in the space for the last couple of years, one of the things that struck me is there's not a good word, there's not a good name for this group of individuals. So back when I was doing my research, we used the word pre-symptomatic if someone had a gene. But we now know, due to incomplete penetrance, as in the expression of that gene may not be 100%, that actually using that word pre-symptomatic is wrong in many cases and could be scary. Could be one of the things that puts people off identifying in that way. You could use a term like gene carrier. Well, that presupposes that you can get tested. And for many people, in the US, people are talking about having to pay $6,000 to $8,000 out of pocket. Or it could be that you're only tested in the context of a research study that might only be looking at 1 or 2 genes. And now we know there are over 40 genes. We also now know with this overlap with FTD, it's important to have a slightly broader spectrum of neurodegenerative genes that you might look for. And increasingly as our understanding has grown, and this is a confusing thing to get your head around, but we used to call it familial ALS, which assumes when you look at a family, let's say you're in the clinic, someone's come to you, they're in their 50s, and they've said, oh yes, mom died of ALS, and now I have similar symptoms, and we know what's going on. However, for many reasons, such as World War II, or incomplete medical records, or adoption, or whatever it is, family breakdown, not everybody knows their complete family history. And even that would require someone who was symptomatic to get in front of a doctor who has the right equipment, who has the right medical training to diagnose this. Back when the NHS was formed in 1948, there was only about 6 neurologists in the entire United Kingdom. One of the wealthiest, most educated, developed nations on the planet. So, if you're saying, well, 4 generations ago, great aunt, whatever, had creeping paralysis, or was thought to have had post-polio, or could have had Parkinsonism, or could have had senility, or just was in a home. Now, with retrospect, you go, this could be it. And actually, we now know that if you could magically do gene testing on everybody with ALS, you would suddenly find that a lot more of it is genetic. And then the final piece, just to be extra confusing, and Patrick will know more about this than I do, you can have these spontaneous mutations, right? You can have aspects of your DNA, aspects of your code that are pathological that mean that you would get a disease that did not necessarily come from your mother or your father. And so that's one sort of additional spice in the cauldron, as you will, which kind of explains why it's not like the scientific medical world has been asleep on the job. It's that this was a more complex picture than we knew what to look for, and it is actually been the coming together, like you say, of families talking within themselves, talking to other families, participating research that now allows us to build out these trees and to understand the mechanisms.
What do you all's perspective on why people who have access to testing might not get it? In the US, I suspect insurance is an enormous part of the equation. There's also, very human fear, concerns, lack of certainty around whether the result is going to be conclusive and might cause even more concern. But then on the flip side, you've got the opportunity to potentially make some major changes to your life in the way that you have, Daniel. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that dichotomy that someone like yourself a few years ago when you went through this process might find themselves in.
Sure. So I found out that I was at risk for C9 about 6 months after I got married. So I was going into this with a trusted partner, a companion, and we had this incredible goal to start a family. So I think that I was, in this Goldilocks place that allowed me to say my own future is not what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about my children, but that is not the case for all. And I'll jump back a second. We found out we could do IVF and PGD, pre-genetic diagnostics, to ensure that our children would not carry or be at risk of carrying the C9 or ORF72 genetic mutation. And that is really the torch that we carried forward to say, I will go find out my genetic status, despite the difficulty of finding that out. I have talked to a wide variety of patients who find themselves at risk for genetic ALS and FTD in a multitude of life stages. And you cannot say that the genetic testing realization is the right understanding for everyone to have at that point in time. And so there's a multitude of reasons why they might not want to learn that information, whether it's the generational trauma they've experienced. I was a caretaker for my father with FTD, but I was not a caretaker for my aunt and uncle with ALS. I think being a caretaker for someone with ALS they're both incredibly difficult, but maybe more traumatic, with that true loss of ability. And I imagine people who go through that as a direct caretaker just have, I do not want to find out if this is ever going to happen to me. And so there's so many thoughts going into their mind. I think that a lot of it also surrounds just not understanding the levers to pull in terms of, do I obtain long-term care, life insurance? Do I go to a regular doctor? Do I go to a longitudinal research study? I know I'm at risk, but what are my options now, right, to ensure that I can have the best next steps that I can possibly take? And that's something that I think needs to be better understood by everyone.
Yeah, so I think Daniel's listed a number of the really key factors there. I mean, the other ones I'd sort of add, and maybe from a UK perspective, is for us, I think it starts more from awareness. Many of my colleagues tell me freely that they historically would not give a ton of information to families about, or they certainly would not push or encourage people to get genetic testing, for the simple reason that it doesn't affect care, or it didn't affect care. So to some extent, let's just keep our fingers crossed and wait, in their mind, had more upside. And the types of concerns they were thinking about was, if you test positive, what does that really mean? Well, you could live for 60 years without any ALS symptoms. You could die of a heart attack, you get hit by a bus. But if you spend the rest of your life worried about what this finding means, you might live a less fulfilled life. Now, I do see that point from an ethical, philosophical point of view. However, the challenge for me was, I feel like some clinicians were making that choice on behalf of their patients, rather than saying, here's the range of options, what do you think? Now, the way that we should be doing this now is not with individual neurologists who are specialists in diagnosis, management, and understand the disease. That actually that work is better done by genetic counselors, which is a specific discipline which covers a lot of the breadth of these psychological, emotional, family, as well as genetic scientific issues. They have the time. And if you ever looked after someone with ALS and you go down to the clinic and you see the great professor, you might see them for half an hour, once or twice a year. And trust me, you're dealing with mobility, ventilation, feeding, end-of-life care. Can I still drive? How are the drugs doing? There is not time to squeeze in, by the way, your child that has drove you to the appointment, would you like me to talk to them about the possibility they might get this disease too? So I understand why people would be hesitant to have that. But I think two things have changed. One is in April of 2023, a gene therapy was approved in the United States by the FDA for a drug called tofersen, or Qalsody, which is for people who carry one of these SOD1 mutations and has evidence that it slows the disease. If we don't test people, we won't know they have the gene, which means they won't be eligible for the treatment, which means we're leaving neuron on the table, we're leaving good quality life on the table. And that has had, I just can't overstate what a massive impact that has had on everybody's risk-benefit calculation. The second thing is family planning. And actually, Daniel, your story and the fact that you've been bold enough to share that story has been a game changer for many people. This has been a possibility most people didn't know about. If they've gone all the way through that journey, most people didn't know about it. I hear from many people, oh, I chose not to have children, or I chose to do other things. Surrogacy, adoption are other options within that sphere. And I appreciate IVF and other things are not within the grasp of many people around the world for all sorts of different reasons. At best of times has a high failure chance. But I suppose the difference is from even, from 2020, those two things tip the balance. they tip the balance now to, instead of having to say, maybe we should offer everybody genetic screening or genetic counseling to see if they want the screening, instead of us having to sort of bang the drum and sort of twist people's arm to do it, actually now the field has come around and said, oh gosh, yes, we should be doing this. And if that's when a real game changer occurs in a field, that almost as one, they all just flip and move in that direction. Then comes the tricky question of how do we do this? Because if you think, well, for each patient diagnosed with the condition, I mean, in the UK, everyone has 2.4 children, right? So are we saying that all these really busy doctors who are, barely making do keeping with the symptom management of all the patients they have on their books who are diagnosed, should they now bring their kids and their nieces and their nephews and their grandkids? Like, we don't have capacity. We don't have the genetic counselors. We don't have the tests. And especially now, we don't know if the penetrance is going to be 100%. What we might be doing is saying to a bunch of people, you're at a different risk than the general population. The average human being on Earth has a 1 in 350 lifetime possibility of developing ALS. Someone who carries a gene, their risk is much higher than that, but we can't actually be certain about how much higher. And sometimes being uncertain for some people is almost as bad as not knowing. I think, Patrick, you touched upon earlier, sometimes there are these things called variants of uncertain significance, right? So there are certain genes which are clearly associated with a much increased risk, but there are these ones which are on the edge, where we might look in the literature and see, oh yes, 1 or 2 people who went on to have ALS also had this little genetic variant which is different than the general populations. But until we either systematically look for that in a population, or if a dozen people crop up with that, we can't say for sure that it's not an anomaly. And again, I think what people worry about is to say, well, how many people would I put in that uncertain bucket? And again, I think that we got to work through that. I think it's not enough just to say, this is hard, let's hang back.
Yeah, I guess, Daniel, you made your decision to get testing before a lot of these things that Paul mentioned happen. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that decision-making process was like for you. Was it easy? Was it hard? What does your support network look like as well? Because you guys alluded to this earlier, but you're not you're a rare breed in many ways. I mean that in as many ways possible, and as good a way possible. And but it's hard to find somebody that has had your specific situation to talk to. So how do you think about that support aspect of this?
Right. So I think the support was incredibly necessary to undergo and take these steps. And I will say I've got 2 brothers, one who've kind of led the way and just understanding his status and ushered me into understanding mine. And so I think that having looked up to my brothers, greatly throughout my entire life, the fact that one had undergone this scary situation made it okay for me to also go through that scary step. I think beyond that, again, having my wife involved and coming into this as a couple, that was a huge support. I know I have someone who will continue to love me despite whatever the test reveals. I think growing up as a young person, surrounded by familial disease, you often think, will people accept me? Will someone want to marry me because of the potential for carrying a hereditary disease that I have? And so I think kind of knowing that allowed me to take that step. And then when it comes to the fact that I've been vocal about my genetic status and about the things that I've done, I think it all comes because when I did find out, I want to say it was 2018 that I found out my genetic status, there truly was no one speaking about the finding out their status or talking openly. And I think that was because of fear of potential retribution from the medical community and what might happen to your medical record, or from insurance or jobs. And, I saw that gap in resources and that gap in advocacy, and just knew that it shouldn't be that way. We have all of these ALS patients who are standing up, fighting for their lives. Why should we, knowing that there is a potential future that we one day develop the disease, not fight for the rest of our lives to ensure that it does not happen? And that was really what, that is what I believed, and that's what's driving me through to today.
Yeah, amazing. Paul, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you've got extensive experience building online tools and communities at patients like me, and I'd love if you could talk a little bit about some of the education and counseling and other resources that'll be available or already are in the US through Light the Way, because I think many people will hopefully be fortunate to have a really strong family, spouse, support network they can lean on, but there will also be other people that unfortunately are going at this alone, whether it's because of a de novo mutation or their life circumstances. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how to think about accessing support if you don't have what sounds like an amazing older brother and spouse that you have, Daniel.
Sure. Well, traditionally, nonprofits, patient charity support groups have been very local. You might get together a group of people with MS or Parkinson's in New York or Boston or a suburb or where you live. And those are great for face-to-face and, all sorts of amazing things. But when you're dealing with something much rarer, like ALS, people are spread out and it's hard to get a critical mass, right? And unfortunately, the mean prognosis for everyone with ALS is in the neighborhood of, a year and a half, 3 years. So by the time people have come to terms with this, are ready to see someone face-to-face, actually they could be pretty sick, and actually it could be pretty challenging, right? So what the internet has enabled is really simple group formation. As early as the late 80s, there was an email listserv going around the internet that was connecting people around the world. I was involved in an initiative at King's where hundreds of people in the UK were talking to one another in online forums, these message boards or discussion boards types of things. I then went to join a company called Patients Like Me, which combined this technology with people's visualizations of their health records over time, so people could see their measurements if they were diagnosed. So in ALS, there's a very well-known outcome score called the ALS Functional Rating Scale. It's questions about your speech, your swallowing, your walking. And at Patients Like Me, we combine this social aspect of conversation with data so that you can see, here's a fast progressor, here's a slow progressor, or here are the solutions that are available to you at this time. What I feel like we're seeing now, though, is obviously social media has been around, in full force for about 10 years. And increasingly, as you go down the generations, especially, that notion that you're going to sit down and write a 1,500-word forum thread about your experience, that's not how it is anymore. It's a 30-second TikTok by our friend Limp Brisket or something, which will tend to be hilarious and very personal and immediate and have 1 million views, raising awareness often from people who don't have ALS, but accessing a different demographic. So in terms of the support that's there, I think for the people either affected with genetic ALS or the gene carriers, get an awful lot out of a different means of communicating with one another. So at the End the Legacy calls that are each week, they're sort of face-to-face on a Zoom hangout, and people can use their real names or not their real names. But I think that's so important because you kind of have this safe space. You are there for the time. What is said in the room stays in the room, and you can see people's faces. Anyone who's spent time on the internet, Twitter's a good example. You put something out there, someone disagrees, you have a bit of an argument, everyone watches the argument. That type of drama happens less frequently when you're all talking to one another and we can see into each other's lives. When people are saying my kids might be at risk, I can often see their kids on their lap, and their cat and their dog and whatever else it is. So it's a different form of immediacy that we can get. So in terms of support, though, there's this new initiative that Patrick mentioned called Light the Way that we've been working on in partnership with End the Legacy and our great scientific advisory board. And like Daniel was saying, I've looked at things in my life and gone, we can do better. And Light the Way is an attempt to do that. And it's trying to fill some of these gaps I've identified. So we're an online platform for people who may be at risk of genetic ALS. So they could already be diagnosed with ALS and be uncertain of their history and their risk. They could be symptomatic, but awaiting diagnosis, or they could be a family member, right? So it could be that, mom or dad has had and has passed away ALS, and they want to know more. So there's the different steps we have. It starts with education. So the people going through this are a cross-section of society. Not everybody did high school biology. Not everybody knows about different inheritance patterns and risk and things like that. So the first step to do is to give everyone high quality ALS specific information. Because if you go out and you look at inherited condition information, a lot of it might be about cystic fibrosis or Duchenne's or Huntington's, and different diseases have different cases. So we developed some high quality genetic information, particularly with the help of our friend Lenny Jatch, who's a genetic counselor at Penn with a ton of experience. And we worked very hard with our sort of colleagues with lived experience to make sure that the language was accessible, to make sure we had videos, visualizations, quizzes to make sure that people understood. And if people don't quite understand, we can kind of say, well, here's a different way to think about it, to sort of make sure everyone has a baseline level of understanding. And that includes both the science, but also an understanding of the consequences of some of these things, right? To sort of say, hey, you may want to be careful, you may want to be mindful about the following things. So once that is complete, people who are eligible can then go on to access genetic counselling. And that's something we're able to provide thanks to a grant from UK government initially, but we're looking to expand that pool of supporters. And that allows people who want to go ahead to have a session on, sort of tele video conferencing, if you like, with a trained genetic counsellor. Now, hopefully, because that individual has now got the educational background about, ALS Genetics 101, they can spend that face-to-face time drilling in on their situation. They're thinking about a job, they're thinking about starting a family, they've heard about a trial, and whatever it is that is specific to them. Maybe their siblings don't want to get tested and they want to do this in secret, right? That's all fine. If they're then, again, interested in going further, Sano Genetics can actually send them a saliva kit in the post, in the mail, and all you have to do is spit in the tube, send it back, and we're actually going to run a very comprehensive panel of genes. So we've sort of worked very hard to make sure it is over 40 genes that are included there. So not just the most common ones, but some of the longer tail, if you like, of things that can come up. So we can be as comprehensive as possible. You can never guarantee that it's 100% comprehensive. We'll be reviewing it constantly to try and ensure it's up to date. And then if those results are something that that person wants to receive, those results will be returned by that same genetic counselor that they spoke to before. So it's the return of results coming from human, someone you've hopefully developed a rapport with, someone who knows your situation, and they'll talk through it, right? And gene by gene, we can say, look, these, ALS causing associated genes are negative. There might be one where you might have a higher risk, but anyone in the population sometimes has a risk gene as well. That might not be something that materially affects your chances like you thought it would. And then on the results of that, we can figure out how to support you. So that wraparound support, I would say, is the key part of it. Now, if you are positive, if you have had a specific gene, then depending on what gene you are found to have and what country you're in, that opens up different resources. We plug everybody into the peer support, we plug everybody into End the Legacy and make sure people know about that research, advocacy, education, peer support that they provide. But then there's research. Right, so there's interventional trials for new therapies, experimental therapies that people might want to consider. There's also observational studies, and so I know Patrick, you had Dr. Michael Benatar on the podcast recently. He's been working on this for many years, and so there are observational studies which I think are becoming increasingly important to understand, biomarkers that might determine risk, but also just understand the natural history, of how these things go. We do want to sort of make people aware of sort of family planning options and things like this. And for those people who sort of want to give back, our hope is that some of the people, not everyone that goes through this, but some of those people will, like you, Daniel, make a stand, get engaged, get activated, be one of the super members of the community. So that's if you're positive. If you're negative, to some extent, and my family was negative, and on some level, we breathe a sigh of relief. On another level, many people who are in the situation, they still may have brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, right? There's a degree of survivor's guilt that can exist. Plus, many of them are going to be caregivers. So it's not like we're out of the fight. We're just kind of, in a slightly different position. And then this third group that we mentioned earlier, these variants of uncertain significance, we will give people all the information we have. As things may update over time, as new scientific publications are coming through, we want to come up with a solution that allows us to, ethically and scientifically inform people at the right time to do that. So that's how we're going. And like I say, anytime throughout this process, you can say stop. If you do the education and you're done, that's fine. That's great. That's a lot better than if you were trying to cobble together information off of, the bowels of the internet. If you have the pre-test genetic counselor and your counselor says, hey, these are the risks, this is what could happen, and you go, okay, then I don't want to get tested right now. That's fine. Okay, so we're not trying to push anyone into a decision they don't want to do. We want to give everyone information. We want to give them plenty of time to reflect on it. And at any point, they could go speak to other people in that community and kind of go, actually, I'm going to hang back, or actually, I'm going to wait until some of the milestone has been reached. So we're really hopeful that that's a resource that can serve people well. We launched in the US in late 2023. We'll be launching in the UK a little bit later on in the first quarter of 2024. And we're looking for this to be in multiple countries, multiple languages. We'll actually be launching a version in US Spanish in a few months' time. So to really open up some of these inequity gaps that may exist for people, because obviously if you're, like I say, in a relatively rich country, or you speak English as your first language, or you live near a major city, it's tough. It's already tough. But if you have, multiple intersectional barriers to accessing healthcare, I'd venture to say it's impossible right now to get anything approaching good care. And I think we all know that has to change.
Yeah, amazing. I also just wanted to add one of my favorite aspects of this that actually came a little bit later in the program is a research study called Beacon that looks at the essentially impacts on test results and choice of getting test results on mental health and other aspects of a participant's journey. And the reason why I think it's so important is because it's obviously something we want to understand, but I think it's also really core to the question on everybody's mind of, and we've referenced it a few times here, of should we genetically test people who have family members but aren't yet symptomatic themselves, and get closer to this 500,000 people in the US that you mentioned, Daniel. And I think a common reason why people advocate not doing it is because they're concerns, potentially legitimate, about the impact on people for uncertain benefit, but nobody's really measured it all that rigorously. And so without data, it just becomes a battle of anecdotes. So I met somebody who it really empowered them, and they were glad they did, and they did. It spurred them on to do amazing things. But we also know somebody who may have been really crushed by the results. So I think that's a super important part. We'll put links to that program and the legacy and many other things that we mentioned in the description. We've just got a couple minutes more here, so I wanted to close out maybe with from each of you guys, anything that we missed discussing that you want to mention, and then any 60-90 second appeal that you have to someone out there who you think could help to make it better, whether it's mine will be for insurance overhaul. I think we're long overdue looking at the role that genetics plays in insurance writ large, because it's not just an issue here, but in almost every other disease. So if there's, my hope is that somebody who can make a difference about this somewhere is listening, probably President Joe Biden or Kamala Harris at the time of this recording. But I wonder if you guys have any appeals to the great and good webinar listeners that you have as well.
So one thing I was going to add was hope, and this is a story that really came to all of our hearts in the ALS International Symposium in Basel in December, about a story which is public, so there's no confidential personal information here, about a young lady in Germany, a teenager, who was diagnosed with ALS with what is a relatively unusual juvenile onset as a teenager, and she had the third most common mutation called FUS, fusion sarcoma. And thanks to a legacy of incredibly brave volunteers who had gone before her, she was able to get this gene therapy, which took her from being bedbound, unable to breathe without a tracheostomy, unable to move, unable to speak, had a positive effect. And this ALS-FRSR rating scale that I mentioned earlier, that I have seen go down to 0 15,000 times, I have never seen it come back up. And Anna walked on stage and accepted an award. So, historically people have said, oh, genetic ALS, it's a very small proportion of people. It's where the hope is, right? I firmly believe it is the exhaust port on this Death Star, and it is time to saddle up in our X-Wings and go nail this sucker.
Amazing.
Beautifully said, Paul. I love the analogy as well. Um, I'll leave everyone with, with Light the Way, with End the Legacy, with all of the resources that now are available for the genetic ALS and FTD community and those at risk. It really is a different calculation than I had or any of the people in your family had a generation ago. And I hope that, despite this being a very difficult decision to make, a vulnerable decision to make, I hope that you understand that the greatest minds are working towards making this easier, are working towards therapies to hopefully prevent or stall progression. And this really is, the Goldilocks moment in time to get wrapped up in hopefully being empowered by these decisions and empowered by being a part of this community. And I think a lot of what we're, all of these resources are wiping away stigma that I think has held back our community and patients for a very long time. And hopefully all of these resources and this webinar does another job at wiping away that stigma that holds people back from saying, yes, I can. So I will leave you with hopefully the encouragement and the energy that yes, you can in whatever way is right for you, but please understand your options. It was, a generation ago that we were blindsided by this. That's no longer necessarily the case.
Amazing. What a perfect note to end on. I just want to say final thank you to both you guys for sharing your stories and also for the many years of dedication that you've put into this. You can only do one thing really with your time and really make the most of it. And what you guys have chosen to do with your time, I think, is just amazing. So thanks for being here, and thanks for dedicating so much of your energy to this.
Thank you, Patrick. Paul, it was a pleasure to be on the webinar with you, and always great to work with you.
Thank you so much, guys.